Hi, Max Vonne here, author of Star Faer. I'm going to talk a little bit about my influences, writers who had a huge impact on me. And number one on that list is Stan Lee. Stan Lee was a co-creator of Spider-Man, the Hulk, Thor, Avengers, Iron Man. The list goes on and on and on. And I really loved those comic books when I was a kid. I got wrapped up into it. My mother used to take me to a laundromat, and I would crawl between the machines to find loose change, and then run next door to a drugstore to buy comic books. And I used to just love them, and the stories were great, and the imagination, the full color magazine, everything about them was just wonderful. And I became a lifelong comic book collector. And I've had some interactions with Stan. I'm going to do a separate video on Stan Lee and how I met him and all of that because he's the one influence I've had that I was actually closest to. But I thought I'd start with him. He's a great influence, and you can probably get a sense for a comic book influence on my work in the sense that I have a lot of action, a lot of plot, a lot of integration. I really love the integrated Marvel MCU, and I want my stuff to be as interesting as that. So, I have a little bit of a competitive streak where I want to build something of a huge scale, and so that was one of the ideas behind Star Faer. But yeah, Stan Lee was a big part of that, and he passed away not a couple of years ago, and I'm still kind of getting over that. But he's a huge loss, and he's a great influence, a great guy, and I just couldn't say enough good things about Stan Lee. He's just amazing. The next person I want to talk about, I'm going to go back to maybe some influences that aren't quite so big, but were there nevertheless. Robert E. Howard is the author of the Conan series, and I used to love those books, and that was really one of my biggest introductions to fantasy, along with J.R.R. Tolkien, and he's the author of Lord of the Rings. I was never like a gigantic fan of Lord of the Rings. I mean, I did like it, but I wasn't like, that in love with it. I probably liked the Conan stuff better, but a lot has to be said about J.R.R. Tolkien. He created the deepest world behind fantasy that anyone had ever seen. I mean, he wrote a functional language for Lord of the Rings, an Elvish language. So, and he had entire histories of the elves, and the background to his mythology is just incredible. And so as I was developing Star Faer, I really thought about that, and I wanted to build something of scope and scale that was on that level. Looking to kind of go beyond Tolkien, and that was one of the drivers behind developing the computerized galaxy. So developing all those stars, planets, and moons, because I wanted to have a backdrop to the stories that was on an epic scale, something on a Tolkien kind of scale. So that influence is pretty big. I mean, I can't say I was a huge lover of the story. I found it kind of, a little dark with all the orcs, and I would, just straight quest. I'm not a huge fan of that. I like character-driven stories a little bit more, and that was more of a good versus evil. But I still recognize it as, just a phenomenal influence on fantasy, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who even thought about writing in fantasy. If you haven't read Lord of the Rings, then you really need to be doing that. Michael Moorcock was a little lesser of an influence, but he did have this really cool series called Elric of Melniboné, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not sure if I am, but you can Google that, and it's a very interesting series. There's 6 short books, really are compilations of short stories, I guess, that he wrote. But I really enjoyed that, and it was a great series and great fantasy writing, and that was written in the 1960s. So that goes back. It's a older style of writing. If you're used to contemporary writing, you're probably not going to enjoy it as much. But I liked it, and I thought it was really cool. One name that is not necessarily associated with fantasy, although I kind of associate it with fantasy, is Quentin Tarantino. And he's not really a book writer, he's a filmmaker, but I really enjoyed his fantasies, as what I would call them, Pulp Fiction, Inglorious Bastards, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. They're just, to me, they're fantasy stories, and what he does with them is just extraordinary, and especially the dialogue and the tension in the scenes. Really love it, and kind of consider that a big influence. I guess maybe I'm cheating a little by throwing in a cinematic influence, but then I kind of have to talk about some of the others. If you've ever seen The Sopranos, there's great tension building in there. Scorsese, big controversy between him and Marvel, but he's definitely a master filmmaker, and then I should probably make a nod towards Star Trek and Star Wars. Obviously, it was influenced by those franchises. Star Trek a lot when I was in my childhood, and Star Wars kind of retroactively. I was never a super huge fan of Star Wars, but I do like it. And Star Trek I was a little bit more into, and then it kind of diluted for me with all the different branches of it. But we'll talk more about that kind of in a different video. So I've kind of saved my last fantasy influence for last, and really the person who kind of gave me the impetus to actually go and do it. It would be George R.R. Martin. And really, I got into Game of Thrones through HBO, and I was just amazed. I mean, I would spend those episodes, because you couldn't really binge watch them as they were coming out season by season, and I would just be on the edge of my seat and then be bummed when it was over and waiting for the next episode a week later. I mean, I still haven't seen anything I think that is that good. Now, he did kind of have a messed up ending, and that's of epic proportions, and that should probably be the subject of a separate video, but it doesn't diminish my love for the story and the characters and the nuancing and the surprises that were in the series. And really, just to me, George R.R. Martin is a game changer in terms of what you can do with fiction, and that attracted me back into it to the point where I wanted to write it. So it can't really be understated there. I mean, I think my two biggest ones are Stan Lee and George R.R. Martin. And I meant to go in a different order, but I should mention Anne Rice in this conversation, and she's a huge influence too. Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire books were just incredible, and really gave you a sense of something. Her writing is so superb, and it really, you shouldn't miss her work. Interview with the Vampire, especially Vampire Lestat. I mean, they're just incredible books. So that's going to be pretty much just wrap it up for this video. I just want to give you like an overview of my influences. Probably should have spent more time on Game of Thrones. Like I said, I feel like that's a game changer in fiction. I started reading the books, and the books are just incredible. They're so well written. I wish he would finish the series. As of this recording, he hasn't, but hopefully that'll happen in the future. And just the phenomenal writing, and pushing the boundaries of what you could do with fantasy, and heroes and good versus evil, and nuancing that so it's much more complex than just the good guys versus the bad guys. Highest recommendation. I know the ending kind of turned some people off, and I'm with you there. I didn't really like the ending of Game of Thrones in season 8, but those are lessons to be learned. It doesn't invalidate the rest of it, which is just incredible. So that's going to do it for this video on influences, and I hope to see you in the next video. If you like it, hit the like button below, and please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you soon.